has, but he is part of a group called
Do No Harm.
Do No Harm. I almost said something different, and I thought, Do No Harm. And I didn't even remember how I was introduced to that group. And as I investigated, I thought, this is really good. I would really like to have this for one of our CPR meetings. And so he was gracious enough. It's a national group, but he lives in the area, Mendota Heights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still remember that. And so he didn't have too far to go here, and I really appreciate him giving us a presentation on the group. And as you probably know, as you walked in, Terry Hands also has some things about some prayer breakfasts coming up that she wanted to make sure people knew about. And of course, the Truth Report has all of that stuff in it too. So I'm going to let Mark Perry take it from here. Thank you for coming, brother.
All right, Dan. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, the title of my talk was The Fall of America's Higher Education and U.S. Medical Schools by Prioritizing Diversity over Merit, Fairness, and Equality. And, you know, based on my experience as a college professor for 30 years and having filed almost 1,000 federal civil rights complaints against U.S. colleges, universities, and medical schools, which is more complaints against of that type of complaint than any individual or organization in the history of federal civil rights laws. So I thought I'd be able to offer some unique insights into the fall of higher education and medical schools as they have started to prioritize diversity over merit. And so I thought I would just explain, give you the history of my journey from now retired economics professor at the University of Michigan to being a full-time civil rights activist and a senior fellow at Do No Harm, which, as Dan said, is a national organization, but everybody now, it's kind of gone virtual like a lot of organizations, so people are all over the country. And that's a medical and policy advocacy group that represents medical professionals to combat the attack on our healthcare system from woke activist and leftist ideology. Now, Elon Musk, who's been a lot in the news lately, you know, he described what's been happening across the country and in medical education and the medical profession as a woke mind virus, and said it's an existential threat to humanity. And it really has spread like a cancer through higher education, medical education, the practice of medicine, corporate America, the government, some of the churches maybe even, etc. So it's all kind of now, there's a little bit of pushback going on. So we're getting some correction there, but as you know, there's been a lot going on with this woke mind virus. So my expertise is challenging two very important civil rights laws, Title VI and Title IX. So I thought I'd just go through a brief legal background about those two very important, landmark civil rights legislations. And so Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was this landmark Civil Rights Act in 64, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities that receive federal funds or federal financial assistance. So President Kennedy proposed this before he was, assassinated. So this is back in 1963. Kennedy said, as they were, proposing the legislation, he said from Kennedy, quote, "Simple justice requires that public funds to which all taxpayers of all races contribute not be spent in any fashion which encourages, entrenches, subsidizes, or results in racial discrimination. Direct discrimination by federal, state, or local governments is prohibited by the Constitution already, but indirect discrimination through the use of federal funds is just as invidious, and it should not be necessary to resort to the courts to prevent each individual violation." So when it was passed in 64, there were actually 11 different titles or sections of the Civil Rights Act, and Title VI was just the one section that addresses discrimination by programs or activities that receive federal funds. So if a recipient of federal funds is found to be in violation of Title VI, that recipient could lose its federal funding. And it summarized the main core body of Title VI is just 40 words. And it says, "No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so there was actually 11 different titles or sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that addressed different types of civil rights and discrimination, including one of the titles was for voting rights, one was for public accommodations, one was for desegregation of public education. There was a title for, Title VII was for employment discrimination. One of the titles was to create the Commission on Civil Rights and so on. So again, yeah, Title VI specifically addressed non-discrimination in federally assisted programs. And so for the work I do, I focus on the recipients of federal funds in education that violate Title VI, and those would be colleges, universities, and K through 12 public schools. And so the federal funds that colleges and universities receive would include the Pell Grants that students are eligible for at below a certain income level, federally insured student loans, and then direct research grants, like University of Minnesota gets almost $1 billion a year for research grants. And they get $1 billion every year from HHS, from National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Department of Education, USDA, and so on. So one thing to remember is that schools are not obligated to accept federal funds. And in fact, there's about 20 colleges around the country, mostly small religious colleges, that don't accept federal funds, including probably the most famous one is Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. And so they don't accept any federal funding, so their students they're not eligible for Pell Grants or federally insured student loans, but they have, financial aid to accommodate that loss of access to federal funding. So a college like Hillsdale, they're not under the jurisdiction of the Department of Education or the Office for Civil Rights, so they would have a lot more, freedom to do what they want in terms of their, sports teams and things like that. So colleges, though, they almost all want the federal funding because that's kind of their lifeblood, and the students need the student loans and so on. Now, what's interesting when I was kind of, going back over the Civil Rights Act, that in both the House and the Senate in 1964, a greater percentage of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act than Democrats. So it was really the Republicans that were behind it. And so in the House, 80% of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act and only 63% of Democrats. And in the Senate, 82% of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 64 versus only 69%. So as much as we think about the Democratic Party being associated with minorities, it was really the Republicans in the 64 that were responsible for passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, did not address discrimination on the basis of sex. So then in the 60s and early 70s, it was kind of the rise of the feminist movement. And so they wanted to have a federal civil rights protection against discrimination on the basis of sex. So then in 1972, they passed some additional legislation to kind of supplement the Title VI and the Civil Rights Act of 64. So then Title IX, it was called Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, was just 37 words, and its main statement is no person in the United States on the basis of sex shall be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So for both Title VI and Title IX, recipients of federal funds, colleges, universities, K through 12 public schools, they have to regularly certify to the Department of Education and other federal agencies that they are actively enforcing all civil rights laws, including Title IX and Title VI, and also discrimination laws that protect against discrimination based on age and disability. And so that's the problem, and that's where my civil rights activism and advocacy comes in, is that while agreeing to enforce Title IX and Title VI, as they're legally obligated to do, most of the colleges and universities are violating Title IX and Title VI because they're having programs, scholarships, fellowships, awards, grants, academic programs, events that discriminate on the basis of sex or race. Some examples would be a female-only scholarship or a black-only scholarship. Those would be violations of Title VI and Title IX. So I was a college professor back in 2016 and was teaching at the Flint campus at the University of Michigan. And so this is how I got started on this path down where I'm at now to challenge civil rights violations. And so my first civil rights advocacy was in 2016, and I was in Flint, Michigan, and Michigan State University is in Lansing, or East Lansing, Michigan, about 40, 50 miles away. And I would occasionally hear that Michigan State had a women's-only lounge. And so I thought, well, that just seems like that can't be legal. And in fact, well, my wife and I visited there in 2016 just to see it. And so this was they had a sign, and it said, "The Women's Lounge, established in 1925, has long been a quiet, secure place for women. It is a safe refuge and serves as a haven for reflection, study, and solitude." Now, that would be okay if there was a men's lounge and a women's lounge. So you can accommodate both sexes separately, just like for sports and athletics, you have to accommodate men and women at the college level. But you can't just accommodate one sex or the other. So it seemed to me that that just had to be illegal. It also seemed to be, maybe unnecessary now that there's more women in college than men, and it's been that way for about 40 years, since the early 80s. Women have kind of been more successful at attending college and graduating from college than men's. And then I just thought it seemed like it was just unfair and unethical to accommodate women with this nice big lounge. And we went there, and you walk into their student union in the middle of campus, big building. You walk in the front entrance, and then the entire wing on the right side of the front entrance was set aside for women only. So I thought, well, that just seems like that has to be illegal. But at the time, I didn't have any, background or knowledge about how civil rights worked. And so I just thought, well, that really seems like that should be challenged. And when I looked around the country, I couldn't find any other example of another university that had a, segregated space just for one sex, in this case, for, the women's lounge. So I thought, well, I'll go to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights and file a civil rights complaint. And so I did that. I filled out the paperwork, and then they were calling me. I had a couple interviews on the phone with some of the attorneys. And one of the things they were trying to determine is whether or not I needed legal standing for my civil rights complaint to proceed. In other words, would I have to go to the women's lounge and be asked to leave or be escorted out by campus police? Then I would have legal standing that I personally had been affected by this discrimination. So while they were going back and forth figuring out if I needed legal standing or not, then I contacted a couple journalists that I knew, and then one of the journalists wrote a story about it, and then it kind of snowballed, and then it just seemed like it kind of caught the media attention, and so then it got reported by the Washington Post and some of the higher education papers and the papers in Michigan, and then all of a sudden it kind of blew up. And so then with that publicity, then I think Michigan State realized that they really didn't have any legal defense to keep doing that. There was no defense for it, for that type of blatant, sex discrimination. So during the summer then of 2016, then they closed the lounge down, and then I had some pictures taken, and it was a lounge temporarily closed. Women's restrooms are on all other floors. Pardon our dust, we're bringing a new and improved MSU union. So that was how they had to fix it, because you can see from their standpoint, if they had just taken that sign down and in the fall opened it up for everybody, it would have blown up. So what they had to do is go through this kind of pretense or theater or charade of saying, well, we're going to remodel this space, and then in the fall when people come back to campus, it's not going to be the women's lounge, it's going to be this newly configured space that looks completely different. And so even though they did that, then the women got a little upset, and there was protests and sit-ins and demonstrations and petitions. But it's just at that point, there was no way they could justify continuing to violate Title IX, because again, their federal funds would be at stake and in jeopardy. So that was kind of my first victory for civil rights. And then after that, then my antenna was up, and then I had been in higher education for almost 30 years and hadn't really paid attention. So then, well, after that, 2017, I got the email that I would get every year from the provost saying, well, there's 11 faculty awards, cash awards plus time off from teaching, so valuable awards, not just a plaque, but money and time off. And so then I realized for the 11 faculty awards, I was only eligible for 6 because 3 were for female faculty only and 2 were for minority faculty only. So I filed a complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, knowing that now this time I have legal standing because I was personally affected by that discrimination, both on race and sex. As a white male, I was denied access to these 5 faculty awards. So then I filed the complaint, and then University of Michigan found out, and they pretty quickly wanted to take care of it, and contacted me and said, well, yeah, we'll change those eligibilities if you'll drop your civil rights complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So I said, yeah, that's fine. That's all I really wanted, was just to have the eligibility changed so it didn't discriminate. So I dropped the complaint. They changed the awards, and those awards today, now all 11 awards, they say specifically they're open to all faculty, all races, and all genders, or all sexes, both sexes. So that was the second victory. So then I thought, well, I can do this. And then right after that, I got an email that all the faculty and staff got at the University of Michigan Flint, that the science faculty were starting this new program called GEMS, which was Girls in Engineering, Math, and Science. And so it was a summer program that they were going to start in the summer of 2017, but it was for middle school girls only, and it was going to be this great summer program. And so again, I realized that's clearly illegal. And then I realized that by the time that program got approved and I got the email, that it would have had to go through a number of faculty committees. It would have had to be approved by department chairs. It would have had to have been approved by deans and associate deans. Then it would go to the provost level. And everybody saw this program, and everybody kind of signed off on it for it to be able to then be announced that this program was starting. So then I thought, well, this is a clear signal that people in higher education either don't know the law or they don't care to follow the law. So either way, it was unacceptable that either they didn't understand federal civil rights laws or they thought they were above the law. So then that one I challenged again, and then they quickly realized that it was indefensible. There's no defense for that kind of discrimination. There's no exceptions to Title IX if you have good intentions. There are really almost no exceptions. So they pretty quickly revised that program and made it open to all middle school students, boys and girls. So it became a co-ed program, and they overturned their original intent to discriminate on the basis of sex. So then in 2018, then I started looking beyond just my own campus and beyond Michigan State, and then looked at the University of Michigan and saw that they had 40 or 50 programs that discriminated mostly on the basis of sex. A lot of, programs for females only, scholarships for female only, awards for female faculty only. So then I'd gotten some advice from some attorneys, and then figured out that you can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, which is the enforcement regulatory agency that enforces Title IX and Title VI for recipients of federal funds. So it's a division within the Department of Education. And so the way it works is that it turns out that anybody can file a civil rights complaint with the Department of Education. You don't need a lawyer, and you don't need legal standing. So you don't need to say, I know of an individual who personally suffered from discrimination. You can just say, University of Minnesota accepts federal funds. They're obligated to enforce federal civil rights laws. They're violating federal civil rights laws. Here's the scholarships, awards, fellowships, programs, whatever they are. And then what they're supposed to do is they assign a case number. They evaluate the complaint, and then they're supposed to, at some point, 30, 60, 90 days, either dismiss the complaint because lack of evidence, or they don't have jurisdiction, or it's beyond the 180-day limit for discrimination, or they're supposed to open it for investigation. Now, that's how it's supposed to work, but, dealing with 1,000 complaints with a federal bureaucracy, I've run into a lot of roadblocks and frustration. So as just one example, I filed a complaint against the University of St. Thomas locally here They have a program called the STEPS program, and it's igniting an interest in STEM for girls in grades 6th and 8th. So it's their STEPS program, Science, Technology, and Engineering Preview Summer Program. They're advertising it again for this upcoming summer, and it's no cost for girls who are in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. It's held at University of St. Thomas School of Engineering. So it's clearly a illegal program, violates Title IX. So I filed a complaint back in December of 2018. It took them a year. They opened an investigation, Office for Civil Rights. Finally, almost a year later, they opened an investigation. Well, that investigation's still open now after 5 years. And I've contacted them, I've contacted the school, and I just can't get them to move forward and close the investigation. And what they would have to do is either cancel the program, or they could open it to all 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students regardless of sex, make it co-ed. Or what they could do, some schools do this, they'll have this program for girls, they'll have an equivalent program around the same time for boys. So they could do 1 week for girls, 1 week for boys, and then everybody's accommodated. But again, just like the student lounge, you can't just accommodate girls and then not accommodate the boys. It's just illegal and unfair and unethical and really immoral. So I filed a complaint then using that process against the University of Michigan for 40 or 50 violations. That investigation was open in January of 2019. It's still open now after 6 years. So sometimes it gets pretty frustrating dealing with this bureaucracy. So maybe now that some of those inefficiencies in government are getting addressed by DOGE and Elon Musk, maybe I'll get some support now. I can have lots of examples of the inefficiency of the Office for Civil Rights. So now, here we are, and as of this week, so I've now filed 973 Title VI and Title IX complaints for more than 2,500 violations that I've uncovered, both through tips from people and also just looking on school websites. And that's at nearly 900 colleges and K through 12 public schools. Some schools I've filed multiple complaints, like University of Minnesota is terrible. They just don't seem to want to follow the law. I filed like 25 complaints against them for more than 50 violations. Some have been resolved, some are still going on. I've also filed complaints against Augsburg, St. Thomas, St. Kate's, Bethel, Hamlin, Gustavus Adolphus, Moorhead State, North Central University, Bemidji State, Carleton College, McAllister College, St. Olaf, Metropolitan State, Minneapolis Community and Technical College, Highland Park Senior High just last week. I'll talk about that later. St. Paul Public Schools. So basically it just kind of shows that almost every college and university is violating either Title IX or Title VI with some of their scholarships, fellowships, programs, awards, prizes, grants, and so on. Now, about 2/3 of the complaints I filed are for Title IX, sex discrimination. About 1/3 are Title VI violations for race, color, national origin. And so early on, when I first started this path of civil rights activism, I was doing mostly Title IX. Then after George Floyd in 2020, then there was all of a sudden lots of Title VI violations, starting with North Central University, downtown Minneapolis, which, they hosted, I think, George Floyd's first of 4 different funeral services. And so they probably had an auditorium like this, and so they allowed the family to have one of their memorial services there for George Floyd. And then at that memorial service, the president of North Central said that he was establishing the new George Floyd Memorial Scholarship for black students only. Clearly illegal. And you just wonder what, he didn't know that or didn't care enough that that was just a completely illegal, just act of discrimination. And then at the service, he said, North Central starting the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship, and I'm challenging every college president and every university president in the country to follow my lead and introduce a George Floyd Memorial Scholarship. George Floyd never went to college. He was kind of a drug addict and felon, so it's kind of interesting that they would think it was okay to name a college scholarship after him. And so again, but just from a legal standpoint, completely illegal. And then after that, University of Minnesota introduced George Floyd Memorial Scholarships. Hamlin did, St. Kate's and Bethel, and I challenged all of those George Floyd scholarships not just in Minnesota, but anywhere around the country where they did follow the lead. And if they said, this is a scholarship for a student interested in social justice or racial justice, or has some background in community service or something, then it would be okay. But a lot of the scholarships just said, this is for a black student only. Now you've crossed the line into the area of unlawful discrimination. It's just indefensible, no excuse for it. There's no exceptions for anything like that. So it just took me a while, but I was able to finally challenge all of those. Finally, after many years, North Central Scholarship, now they changed it to, it's called the Floyd Scholarship, not the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship, and they changed the eligibility finally to, it says something about social justice or community service or something, so they removed the illegal eligibility restrictions based on race. And so of the complaints, I filed, about 600 have been resolved, mostly in my favor, and then there's about 300 that are still either being evaluated or being investigated, like Michigan and St. Thomas going back 5-6 years. So when they're resolved in my favor, then that's when the school agrees to either discontinue the program, change the eligibility restrictions to remove any kind of eligibility based on race or sex, or in some cases they can introduce an equivalent. If it's like a summer STEM program for girls, they can introduce an equivalent boy-only program. So once in a while that will happen. So they have to really do one of those three things. Discontinue the program, change the eligibility to comply with Title IX and Title VI, or have an equivalent program to offset a girl-only program in most cases. Then in the summer of 2022, that's when I started working with Do No Harm as the head of their Civil Rights Division. And I'm the only person really, well, one other person kind of helps me with it, but I'm mostly just doing this as, just on my own to file their complaints on their behalf against U.S. medical schools, challenging programs for what they call URIM, underrepresented in medicine. And at the time, in 2022, I had filed a lot of complaints, but I hadn't really focused on medical schools, so I wasn't even really aware of all the discrimination going on, mostly on the basis of race. And what they mean, and they even state this most of the time, what they mean by underrepresented in medicine is students, or it could be faculty, who are Black, Hispanic, or Native American. But the groups that are considered overrepresented are whites and Asians. So there's a lot of these programs. U.S. medical schools almost all have, or at least now they're being challenged, but they all have some kind of diversity or URIM, underrepresented in medicine scholarships, clerkships, fellowships, internships, awards, special programs. And just as a couple examples, this is one of many. This was the Indiana University School of Medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine. They have these academic scholarships, and this one is for students who belong to a group considered to be underrepresented in emergency medicine: Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, or identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. So obviously then on the race part, they're not including whites or Asians. So again, clearly illegal. It's just a blatant violation of Title VI. This is University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. They've got a pre-doc program, and that's for high school students or undergraduate students who want to go into medical school. And it's those who identify from backgrounds that have been historically minoritized in medicine. And then that includes African American, Black, Mexican American, Latinx, Hispanic American, Indian, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander. So it never includes whites or Asians. So again, those programs are being challenged and are still either being evaluated or being investigated. So then on behalf of Do No Harm, the medical group, I filed about 150 Title VI complaints versus U.S. medical schools, and about 100 have been resolved, and about the other 50 are still being evaluated. So we've had pretty good success challenging medical schools because again, there's no legal defense. There's no way that they can legally defend it. So once they're exposed and they're challenged, and then they're either contacted by us or by the Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, then they usually will pretty quickly, change their eligibility. And one issue related to the URIM programs is the academic credentials for medical school students by race and ethnicity. And back when the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC, they used to publish detailed data on by race and ethnicity on the students who applied to medical school, the students who were accepted to medical school, and then what GPA and what MCAT score they had. So then I was able to determine, and this was going back, that they stopped publishing these data, I think, because I would, kind of publicize these. But back in between 2013 and 2016, if you look at an average MCAT score, which was 27 to 29, and an average GPA for students that got into medical school, which was about 3.5 to 3.6, those were kind of considered average credentials. That with average credentials, black students had an 81% chance of getting accepted, whereas Asian students had a 21% chance with those same credentials. So a black student with the same credentials as an Asian student was 4 times more likely to get into medical school than the Asian student. And, huh? Oh, yeah. So there's clearly, some discrimination in admissions. They clearly are trying to, achieve what they would consider some kind of greater, racial diversity in medical schools. And the problem is it's just that, to be honest, based on the data, the Asian students especially are so much more qualified than even whites. So just now, they don't publish those data where I can say the percentages for students who are accepted, but they still published average MCAT scores and GPAs for U.S. medical matriculants, students who were accepted by race and ethnicity for this current academic year. So the average Asian student who's in medical school scored in the 88th percentile on the MCAT score. The average black student who is in medical school got accepted, scored at the 67th percentile compared to the 88th percentile, and Hispanics score at the 66th percentile, whites at the 83rd. So whites and Asians are clearly the most qualified medical students based on their MCAT score and GPA, but it's just that they are kind of become very much obsessed with trying to have racial diversity in the medical field, and so the only way they can do that is to lower the standards for the black and Hispanic students to get what they want is their targeted racial, diversity in medical students. Now, one of the other issues that gets into, a serious issue in medical school is that usually in medical school, once you're admitted, the grades they're pretty easy on the grades. Not like law school. Usually in law school, they're pretty stingy on the grades, and then there's a class ranking based on your grades. Medical school, they're kind of easy on the grades. But then you have to take these, what are called Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3 medical school exams to make sure that you're learning at a level that you can then keep going on to finish your medical training, medical education. So Step 1 is the first of 3 standardized exams for the medical licensing exam, and it's required for medical licensure in the United States. So Step 1, they usually take it at the end of the second year. It assesses foundations of medical science knowledge and skills acquired during the first 2 years of medical school. It's a multiple choice format. It's 280 questions covering topics like anatomy, biochemistry, pharmacology, and pathology. It's an 8-hour exam, so it's pretty intense, but that's how they make sure that after your second year of medical school that you're ready to go on to the third and fourth year and eventually become licensed as a medical doctor, physician. And then as of 2022, because so many students, mostly minority students, weren't passing at a certain level, they now, as of 2022, made Step 1 pass-fail so that they could get the students to get through who weren't passing before. So that's one of the recent changes, again, to accommodate minority students in medical school, is to water down the exam or make it pass-fail, and you can take it 4 times. Then step 2 is another one-day exam, and that's now also pass-fail. So, part of what's kind of behind this is in the medical field, medical education, again, the woke mind virus, is this one really kind of, I'd say, a very dangerous assumption or, narrative or theory. It's called racial concordance. And there's really no basis for this and evidence. But the racial concordance idea is that if you're a black patient, you can only get served best medically by a black doctor or nurse. So that's this whole idea that because blacks are maybe, 12% of the population, but only 5% of the medical doctors are black, that now there's this imbalance. And so now for racial concordance, we need more black doctors to get somewhere close to 12% doctors so that then black patients can get served only by, they can get the best medical service by black medical professionals. There's just no, if you're having a heart attack or need surgery or something, it shouldn't matter what the race of the person is. It's just you want the best medical care. And so this whole idea of racial concordance is kind of behind, well, we need more medical students, more black and Hispanic medical students, so now we have to have different admission requirements for them, and then we have to have different, have a pass-fail to make sure that they get through. And so that's kind of where I've fit into the Do No Harm, organization. And some of the other, so I'm do all their civil rights filings and do all the civil rights complaints. And then some of the other Do No Harm issues, that they're really advocating for competent medical care for individuals regardless of race. They really reject this whole idea of racial concordance. They oppose the idea that we hear a lot about is that the U.S. medical care and medical system and medical education is somehow racist. They reject that whole notion. They're trying to keep leftist ideology, anti-racism, critical race theory, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, out of medical education and medical care. And so we're also trying to draw attention to this radical ideology of anti-racism in healthcare. And it's been increasingly embedded within medical education and training, medical research, medical practice, medical public policy, and it really is promoting divisive and discriminatory ideas. The reality is not well known, so we try to shine a light on the scale of the problem and offer concrete solutions to fix it. They're also very important. They're trying to protect minors from gender ideology and chemical and surgical mutilation. And so we're trying to, curtail the unscientific and individually harmful practice of so-called gender-affirming care, which is based on the premise that any child who has any kind of distress that he or she thinks is related to their sex should be automatically treated with social transition to the sex of their choice, followed by hormonal interventions, chemical interventions, and then possible surgery to remove healthy body parts. The underlying mental problems are usually not addressed. So, what is also another issue is that what's called gender-affirming care, big in Minnesota, ignores the impossibility for the informed consent of minor children who can be subjected to chemical and surgical mutilation. Minor children and adolescents are inappropriately being allowed to make potentially irreversible, life-altering decisions, in many cases without parental consent or engagement. Now, one interesting fact is that not a single United States state, no state in the United States allows minors to get tattoos with or without parental consent. But we allow minors to get double mastectomies and other surgeries with lifelong implications and possible complications as minors. So that's part of, Do No Harm's advocacy, and they do a lot of public policy work, and they try to influence state legislation. So that's an area that I'm not directly involved with, but that's very important. Now, one more issue here before I can conclude. As I mentioned, it's often, difficult working with a federal bureaucracy like the Office for Civil Rights. At least it has been in the past. Hopefully that'll change. Because even if they break up the Department of Education, they would still have to have a Office for Civil Rights to enforce federal civil rights laws for federal recipients. So what they're talking about is if they completely just kind of break up Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights would get moved over to the Department of Justice, which might be a better place for them. So I guess my work will continue because there will be an Office for Civil Rights, whether it's at DOE, Department of Education, or DOJ, Department of Justice. But given the ineptitude, I guess, and slow response from Department of Education, one of the other alternative strategies that we've used very successfully is that I'll file a complaint against a college, university, K through 12 school, and get that on record with the Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, and get a case number assigned, a docket number, so that it goes into their registry, into their records. Then after that, I share a courtesy copy of the complaint with, if it's a college or university, with the Office for General Counsel, the school's legal division. And those are the lawyers who, that's their main job, is to minimize or eliminate legal risk for the university. And so often when you get the attention of the lawyers, whose job it is to address legal risk for the university, sometimes they'll start making immediate changes, sometimes within 24 hours or 48 hours. So we've had pretty good luck getting the complaint on record at OCR and then sharing it as a courtesy with the school administrators, the president, the Office for General Counsel, and whoever else might be involved. And often that gets their attention, and sometimes changes happen within a day or a week compared to 5 or 6 years. And one example of that just took place this last week, and it received a lot of local and international attention, is that I became aware at Highland Park Senior High School in St. Paul that they were advertising and promoting this field trip that was supposed to take place on last Thursday. It was a digital marketing and advertising field trip, February 27th. Students will learn about careers in marketing and advertising. They were going to go to a downtown Minneapolis marketing agency called Betty, and it said the students must be in 11th or 12th grade and identify as a student of color and be interested in learning more about careers in marketing. So that, again, clearly illegal, no excuse, it's legally indefensible. And so as soon as I found out about this, I filed a complaint last Tuesday morning with the Office for Civil Rights. And then at about 10 in the morning, I shared a courtesy copy of my complaint with the principal, administrators at the school, St. Paul Public Schools, the school district level, all of their top administrators, and then some of the executives at Betty Advertising, who somehow agreed to host a racially segregated group of students to come to their marketing agency in downtown Minneapolis last Thursday. So I got their attention, and by about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I got an email from the principal at Highland, and he said, yeah, we canceled the program, which is what I wanted. I told them that the ways that they could fix it is they could cancel the program or they could open it up to all students, regardless of color. And I even said that if you make those corrections, I'm happy to withdraw the complaint, because I'm not trying to get them, fined or in trouble. I'm just trying to get them to stop discriminating. That's my goal. So that was the outcome that I wanted and expected, and it happened within about 4 hours or something like that. So that's an example of sharing a courtesy copy with somebody at the school or university and then having them take immediate action instead of this at the Office for Civil Rights could take years and years. And then what happened in this case is that a reporter at the St. Paul Pioneer Press found out about it and called me, and she ended up doing a story in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Then the Minneapolis Star Tribune found out about it, and they did a story. Then KMSP, Channel 9, Fox 9, they heard about it and came to our house and did an interview, and it was on Channel 9 News last week. Then Alpha News, the local really great news organization that you probably know about, they wrote about it. And then all of a sudden, I get an email from a reporter in London from the Daily Mail, and they heard about it, and so they wrote a story about it. So it kind of went global. And then Fox News at the national level did a story about it a couple days ago, not on air, but just on their website. So that's an example of where sometimes if you can get the attention of the right people and they're honest and principled and they realize once they're exposed that they can't defend it. And so that was a local kind of solid victory. Well, let me just say then in conclusion after that little last anecdote that you should really, if you haven't yet, check out the Do No Harm website. It's at donoharmmedicine.org, and you can become a member just by signing up to get their regular emails. You don't even have to make a donation. You can just register and make a donation, or even if you don't, they'll get you on their list. And if you work in healthcare and become aware of something troubling or illegal, whether it's illegal funding based on race or something related to gender-affirming mutilation or some kind of mandatory DEI training as a nurse or physician's assistant or dentist, that's part of your job or part of now sometimes your recertification of your credentials when you have to take these continuing education classes. Sometimes you're required to do diversity training or critical race theory training. You can submit a tip on the Do No Harm website, either using your name or you can just be anonymous. But there's lots of charities and nonprofits and organizations doing great work, and Do No Harm is really one of them. So they'd love to get you involved as a member if you feel moved to support them. It's really a great organization doing great work, making lots of progress to advance competence in ethics in medicine by influencing public policy at the state and federal levels and then challenging illegal discrimination, which is kind of my specialty in the work I do for them. So with that, I think we're within our allotted time period. And so that's all I've got. And so thank you very much for your time and attention.
Man. I'll tell you, this is twice as good as what I expected. Not that I expected it. You are my kind of guy.
Okay.
Totally. Everything he said, I thought, well, just really lines up. And we could go on and on. But do we have questions for him? We still have a half hour if we want to ask some questions.
I was just wondering if you had had any suits against the University of Minnesota Duluth Medical School. 40 plus, I won't say how many years ago, they were already doing this with Native American students getting preference over if you were white. It scared me because one of the people that got in was someone I knew. I met him while I was going to school there. If he showed up for class, he was inebriated, if he showed up for class. Took him 10 years to get his bachelor's degree, but he was accepted into their medical school because he was Native American.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, okay.
That's a great story. And, one issue is that challenging federal civil rights violations is that, Native Americans, sometimes they're considered a race or ethnicity, but then sometimes they're considered a political group. And so if they're a political group, then sometimes they're outside of the jurisdiction of a Title IX, Title VI. So it kind of I don't know that there's any clear law on that because I've sometimes have filed for Native American discrimination in favor of Native Americans. And sometimes they'll say that's a political group. We don't have jurisdiction. Other times I think they will consider it as a violation based on race or ethnicity or national origin. So that's a little bit of a fuzzy area, but yeah, it's an interesting kind of
question.
Could this field trip last Thursday in St. Paul, I'm just wondering the insanity of it all, and this, they said, who identifies as black or however you put
student
it.
of color.
A student of color, okay. So could a white student who wanted to participate in that program, that field trip, say, I identify as a student of color?
Yeah, white is a color, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and sometimes instead of student of color, they'll use the acronym BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, which is still yeah, it's still people of color. So then, but it's never quite clear which groups are in that and which aren't. Sometimes Asians are considered minorities, or like in medicine, they're considered a majority, or yeah. So, and even student of color, yeah, I mean, it's not very well defined. And in this case, it was actually, there's an organization called Brand Lab, which is some nonprofit group in Minneapolis. They're the ones that arranged the field trip. So it wasn't really Highland Park. I found that out later. I mean, based on the flyer, it looked like it was a Highland Park field trip, which it clearly was, although it was being kind of organized by this other Brand Lab. And Brand Lab, you know, wouldn't be a federal recipient, so they wouldn't themselves be able to be challenged legally, but because they involved a public school that accepts federal funding. Yeah, so the whole thing just kind of blew up, and I think they realized now they should have never gotten into that.
Well, and not that any white students or students, people that are, it gets so complicated, people that are not students of color, not that they should have to do that, the whole thing. I'm glad you did what you did to just do away with it, because it's so stupid. And then last thing is, this is actually hurting the blacks and the Hispanics, because people like me who know that this is going on in the medical schools and they're taking less qualified applicants are way less apt to see a black doctor or a person of color or a Hispanic or whatever. And because knowing this, that maybe they were less qualified. So if you're a black doctor or a Hispanic doctor that was really super qualified, top of the class, that's hurting them because of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, their credentials are always kind of in question, or they carry that kind of stigma. You could be Dr. Ben Carson and be at the top of your field, but, you know, you could always be, I mean, I guess his qualifications are, you know, well recognized, but somebody not as well known, that you would always, could be a nurse or a physician's assistant, nurse practitioner, or a doctor, and then you would maybe always question, well, were they really qualified to get into medical school? Were they just, you know, did they get through those step 1, step 2, and step 3 exams on a pass-fail basis? And yeah, so I mean, then their whole, their credentials come into question, which is a disservice to them.
Appreciate you being here. That's great. Liberty University was just sued because a fellow who took just a mediocre job, in order to be working for Liberty, no matter if you're a teacher or what, you have to believe 100% in God's word, and if you don't, you're kicked out of there. So he took the job. His name is, I'll just use a name, David White. After 90 days, he says, "I want you to call me Mary." And so the board of directors kicked him out right away, and Liberty, Matt Staver took a lawsuit against them. And of course, the LTGPK or whatever got involved, so that's where that one sits right there. Those lawsuits cost a lot of money. I think of one with Philadelphia on the flag, and Matt Staver took that one all the way Supreme Court. When they won that one, Philadelphia had to pay just the legal fees, $1,125,000. It takes a lot. Where do you get your money, and who's behind you? And I've got a couple of other things. I'll talk to you later.
Oh, where does Do No Harm get their funding? Yeah, I mean, it's really just all based on individual donations. You know, I think their main group that is interested are the doctors and nurses and medical professionals who really support the organization and just give $10, $10,000. So I think it's just, you know, individual donors that help, and then they might have some foundation money. You know, that's because we don't meet like in person in an office, and I'm not always aware of like all the fundraising going on, but they have been very successful raising money and being able to challenge, you know, some of the laws with federal lawsuits, and so that requires money. But yeah, so did you have any kind of knowledge or comment? Oh. Oh, another question. Oh, okay. So yeah, so in terms of the funding for Do No Harm, it's just all individuals, maybe some foundations, and I think there's, you know, maybe a lot of doctors who are, you know, have the financial resources to support some organization like this that they really think is valuable to the medical profession. So I guess that's where we get a lot of the funding.
Mark, where do you get paid?
What is it?
Where do you get paid? Who do you get paid from? Do
How
no
I-
harm?
Yeah, I get a small salary from Do No Harm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your wife supports you?
Yeah, well, she's my assistant. And then I work for another organization kind of doing the same thing. It's called Equal Protection Project. It's part of the Legal Insurrection Group. Bill Jacobson is a law professor. And they're kind of doing the same thing, filing federal civil rights complaints. And since I have so much experience, they hired me kind of as a consultant. So yeah, Equal Protection Project, and then Do No Harm. I agreed to take a very small salary because it wasn't really, something that I was interested in, doing full time. It's more of a part-time job for me, for them, and so.
Well, I appreciate that, and we don't want to get too personal on you either, but thank you for that information. Here's another question.
Yes, when you said the thing about the tattoos, that every state, I looked it up because, not that I didn't trust you, but just that I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Now, let me read to you what Minnesota says. No minors can get tattoos in Minnesota, even with parental consent. This is because tattooing a minor is a gross misdemeanor. Then one last thing. Tattooing a minor is illegal in Minnesota because minors cannot legally enter into contracts or get informed consent. Unbelievable.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so here's my question. I heard about an LGBTQ program at the U of M that had dolls for children where you could change the genitalia. You could put a vagina on it one day, and maybe another day you could put on a penis, and you can pick whichever one you want to be that day. They're trying to train the kids and groom them early. So I called up, spoke to the director, and wanting to know what they're going to be used for, and they are for training kids at an early age. That goes against totally what we believe as Christians. Yeah. So I didn't know where to go after that. What do I do? Could I do a complaint? Could I do something at that point?
Well, there's, everything's kind of changing a little bit now. There was a couple weeks ago, there was a Dear Colleague letter issued by Craig Trainer, who's the Assistant Secretary at the Department of Education for the Office for Civil Rights. He sent out this Dear Colleague letter. That was mostly at the college level. They just kind of reinforced it a couple days ago with the frequently asked questions document that came out on Friday. Now, what's interesting about that is, and I think the new administration will really try to crack down on that type of grooming at an early age. Under the Biden administration, they expanded Title IX from discrimination based on sex to discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. But that's now been reversed. It's gone back to just being protection on the basis of sex. So some of the LGBTQ stuff now is kind of, we're not quite sure how that's going to fit in with this new administration. And like something like that, I don't know if it would be like a title. Well, see, it would be hard to know what kind of federal civil rights law that's violating. So I'm just not quite sure yet, but I hope that with the new administration, cracking down or trying to prevent, or promote fairness in women's sports, like the rally that's going on today with Riley Gaines down at the Capitol. I think they're taking a very strong position on that. And so maybe that's kind of the first step, protecting women in sports, and then a lot of this LGBTQ training. Because again, they're a recipient of federal funds, University of Minnesota, so they are under the jurisdiction of the Office for Civil Rights and Department of Education. So I guess, we'll have to kind of see how that all works out here.
Well, I'd like to make the observation that, most people would think that thou shalt not kill is a very important commandment. Not that others aren't important as well. But here's my question. When you look at these medical colleges and universities, their indiscretion during the selection process of the candidates they want to educate. If we look towards the issue of wrongful death, is that perhaps an avenue that would put the fear of God into those institutions?
Well, and how would that work? Because they're supporting abortion or because of,
No, because they're putting unqualified individuals, forcing them into the workforce.
oh, I see.
So if you compared, their poor performance with those that would have been selected on the basis of their abilities,
Yeah, I see. Yeah. So it could be because then they're going to be offering substandard care, which could in some cases result in death. So maybe that would get worked out through the malpractice insurance, and if some unqualified doctor who got through medical school but didn't really learn what he or she was supposed to, that if that results in complications or, injuries or even death, then maybe that would get, worked out through lawsuits against the hospital, lawsuits against the doctor. So, but that's a good point. Yeah, I mean,
but I wonder if there wouldn't be some also blowback against the institution that chose to train them.
yeah. I mean, it seems like, the two areas where you want the most qualified people would be, doctors and pilots. But pilots have been corrupted by DEI and critical race theory along with medical education. So hopefully we're kind of moving back in a common sense direction. So again, you think of the tattoo legislation that must have been passed in every 50 states, all the 50 states. That was at a time when people thought a little more clearly or had a little more common sense. And maybe if that came up today, they would just consider it to be okay. But yeah, I mean, I don't know when all that legislation was passed, but it was back when people thought more clearly and had a lot more common sense than today.
I do find how interesting that this whole ideology has been around a long time, and it's just really showing itself much more these days. I can remember taking a police test to be a cop for St. Paul, and I was one of the top 50 that were there, but I wasn't a certain color, and so I was put off for years later, or a year later they called me to work. But so that was back then, and I can remember when my son was playing hockey, and on the registration form it said gender, and I said, what's that? Now this is 50 years ago. What's gender? And then I realized, why are they calling it that? And we all kind of accepted that over the years. And this whole, equality versus equity is a big example of what they're trying to do, change society, and it's not the right way of doing it.
Yeah, well, one easy way to kind of understand what it is, what's going on, is that DEI stands for didn't earn it.
Didn't earn it.
And CRT stands for creating racial tensions.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at today. And luckily we're kind of moving.
Any other questions? Over here, Mark.
Could you please give us a definition for woke mind virus?
Definition of woke mind virus.
Well, I think that's maybe, and that's what Elon Musk, would talk about. I think it's just the leftist ideology that has crept into, education that would include, things like, grooming of young kids with, gender ideology, would include, gender mutilation, would include, all of the, kind of leftist notions, leftist ideology that have really kind of destroyed higher education. So I guess it's just maybe the leftist mind virus is what, in addition to the woke mind virus, but it's just, and it's usually like once people buy into that, they buy into a whole set of issues that they all seem to agree on, including open borders and gender mutilation and, critical race theory, DEI. So I guess that's what Elon Musk meant by it. But for maybe an expanded definition, I think he's described it in videos and online. So if you just do a search for woke mind virus, Elon Musk, he could probably explain it better than I just did.
Good job.
Has Do No Harm addressed any cases of medical freedom?
I don't know, like what's an example or what's that issue?
Well, this whole having to be vaccinated,
Oh,
which goes again, it can go against religious beliefs?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, because, they started after COVID. I joined in 2022, and they had been going just maybe for about, I joined summer of 2022. I think they started earlier in 2022. So I think their organization started after the COVID hysteria and the COVID.
I was not allowed to work until January of '24.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
So I was discriminated against.
Yeah.
Also, your cases are all public institutions mostly, whereas it's my understanding you can't address it with a private institution. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, private organizations have a lot more latitude for being outside of the, discrimination laws. So, I mean, at some point they could get either sued or challenged, but it's just, it's easier if they accept federal funds, which would be a hospital, almost all hospitals, all medical schools, all, colleges, universities, K through 12 public schools. So it's easy to challenge them under federal civil rights laws. If it's a private school, well, not at the college level, but like a Catholic school, K through 8 or K through 12, they might be somewhat exempt. Or like if it's a private organization, like this Brand Labs, that was the one that offered Highland Senior High to get involved with this racially discriminatory, racially segregated field trip. But yeah, as a private organization that doesn't accept federal funds, they have a little bit more flexibility in discriminating. So,
What about nonprofits?
well, nonprofits, yeah, I mean, unless they get federal funds somehow, then they would be outside of Office for Civil Rights, or, yeah, I think nonprofits would be exempt.
They could possibly lose their nonprofit status if the government wanted to come in and say, hey, you can't discriminate. What if this meeting here, which I'm a nonprofit, said that we wouldn't allow blacks to come in?
Okay, yeah. Well, and that might be violation of state civil rights laws.
Okay.
So then it could be Minnesota Department of Civil Rights would come in and
Right.
say that's not allowed. Public accommodation, no, organization can discriminate at a, church or a restaurant or some event.
So we do allow non-Christians, but we invite Christians to be a part of this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask somebody if they're Christian or not, but this is for Christians to understand what we're shining a light on that day, which was great stuff today.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Another question.
Well, as I was following your presentation, it seemed like you said in the beginning when you first started out that you applied to, was it the Michigan State Civil Rights or something? And they
Michigan
said,
Department of Civil Rights.
okay, and it ended up you needed to have standing and you didn't have a personal experience, so it wasn't
Well-
going to go forward, and then you found it more effective to go to the
Well, what-
federal? Maybe you could explain that a little more.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I might have left out a couple of the details. So when I filed the complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and they were processing my complaint, and we were kind of going back and forth, they hadn't made a final determination yet whether I needed legal standing for that complaint to go forward with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. But during that time when they were evaluating my complaint, that's when it blew up in the media. And then Michigan State in the summer of 2016 responded to the attention in the media and closed down the student lounge, women's lounge, and then remodeled it. So by the time Department of Civil Rights got around to, I guess, figuring out what they were going to do, the complaint had already been resolved because they had opened up that space to all students in the fall of 2016. So I'm not quite sure how it would have worked out if they would have said, okay, we'll process the complaint, but you need legal standing or somebody needs legal standing. They never really quite resolved that issue.
I was just wondering if anything's being done about the current requirements for teacher licenses in the state of Minnesota. I would no longer qualify to be licensed as a teacher. Thank goodness I'm retired, but Walls has passed several executive orders requiring that you have to do CRT training, DEI training, LGBTQ training, and you have to sign off that you agree with all of those before you will be issued a teaching license in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, I haven't followed that as closely as, medical education. But, the local group that really does focus on that is the Center of the American Experiment. Yeah, and so I think they've addressed that. And then now this new ethnic studies that's supposed to be coming in where it would be indoctrinating kids in the classroom. You're talking more about licensing requirements. And now it's this new ethnic studies that I think starts in first grade or something, and it's all about U.S. being a racist country and so on. That's being, I think starting maybe this fall. Yeah, that Catherine Kirsten, she's a friend of ours. She's the one that writes about that a lot, and I think has had some recent articles. But yeah, we follow Center of the American Experiment and get their weekly updates. And so they're often, focused on state level issues like teachers. Center of the American Experiment. Yeah, I think it's americanexperiment.com. They're a local group. They've been around for quite a while, 30 years or more. And it's a great organization. They have, speakers. In fact, Riley Gaines, who's at the Capitol today, she was one of their speakers last year. We went to see her speak for Center of the American Experiment. And they're so successful that their offices got firebombed about a year or two ago. And I know they offered a huge reward for that, and I don't think they've ever come up with anybody. But yeah, their offices were firebombed in the middle of the night and completely destroyed. So that means that they're effective or successful if they're getting firebombed.
One last question.
First of all, thank you for everything you do. But second, in light of the firebombing, do we need to be praying for your safety? I'm sure you have a lot of enemies. That's a serious question.
Well, I've been doing this now for 7, 8 years. And so far, I've been kind of almost surprised that I haven't received more blowback. And I really have never, except for the women's lounge at Michigan State, that's stirred up a hornet's nest. And then all of a sudden I'm getting threatening emails and voicemails, and it was kind of scary back then. But ever since then, like with this Highland Park high school, it's got national and international attention, and I haven't gotten any, direct threats. Or, I mean, if you look at the Star Tribune, you look at the comments, everybody says I should get a new hobby, and maybe. So I always tell them, well, it seems like your problem's with Title VI, not with me. Title VI says you can't discriminate. They discriminated. It was illegal. That's just the law. It's nothing to do with my opinion. So if you don't like what I'm doing, it's really, you must not like Title VI, or you want it applied selectively without, uniformity. But no, so yeah, I don't get any threats so far.
Well, can I pray for you anyway?
Oh, sure.
Let's pray.
All right.
Father, we thank you for Mark and his ministry and all that he's accomplished. Lord, we believe based on your word that people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the qualifications and the content of their character and their conversion. And so, Father, we pray for Mark's continued effectiveness in this area. And Lord, although he doesn't seem to be too concerned about safety, he has had threats apparently. And so, Father, we pray for both Mark and Mary that you would keep them safe, and that these threats have got to be disconcerting at least. We pray you'd give them your peace and give them safety, Father. And we ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What do you think? Was he worth listening to today? My goodness.
All right, Dan.
Thank you.
All right, good.
He's a good man, Mary. I can see that. Yeah. So thank you for coming. You have a question? Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
We want as many people here as possible. And, we don't charge. So please tell your friends to come on in. And, you've got friends that aren't working, and we should fill this place up. It really good. When we've got speakers like this, I mean, just excellent. I thought I'd love to have him as my professor. I was just geared into what he was saying, and his ideology is just me. And I thought it's just perfect stuff, and I think it's pretty much for everybody here. So thank you so much.
Well, maybe a year from now or sometime in the future, I'll come back and do an update.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
God bless you for today.
Yeah, thanks. All right.